My wife used to joke, "At least the neighbor's helpful." I didn't know how helpful. One night, I came home early. Her purse was gone. So was his truck. They came back together. I didn't say a word. But a month later, I took our son for a DNA test. The lab tech looked at me and said, "You should sit down." You know how some stories start with everything being perfect and then shit hits the fan? Well, mine started with everything being just okay, which somehow made what happened next feel even worse. My wife Jessica and I had been married for 8 years, living in this quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business but pretended they didn't. We had our 3-year-old son Tommy, a mortgage that kept me awake at night, and neighbors who seemed friendly enough. The neighbor in question was Greg. This guy in his early 40s who lived alone in the house next door after his divorce went through about 2 years back. Real handy type, always fixing something or helping someone move furniture. Jessica used to make these little jokes about him being so helpful, especially when I was working late at the accounting firm trying to make partner. She'd say things like, "At least Greg's around to help when you're not," or "Good thing we have such a helpful neighbor," whenever he'd come over to fix our leaky faucet or help her move the couch. I thought it was innocent. Hell, I was grateful. The guy was saving me money on handyman calls, and Jessica seemed happy having someone reliable around. Greg would show up with his toolbox, fix whatever was broken, maybe stay for a beer afterward. We'd talk about sports, work, normal guy stuff. He seemed decent enough, quiet but friendly, the kind of neighbor you want when you're trying to build a life in suburbia. But then I started noticing little things. Jessica would mention Greg's name more often in conversations. She'd know details about his day that seemed oddly specific. When I'd come home from work, sometimes there'd be this lingering smell of his cologne in our living room, even though she'd say he'd only stopped by briefly to drop off some mail that got delivered to his house by mistake. The first real red flag happened on a Thursday evening in March. I was supposed to work late again, but my client canceled last minute, so I headed home around 7 instead of my usual 9:30. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Greg's red pickup truck wasn't in his driveway like it usually was. No big deal, the guy had a life. But when I walked into our house, Jessica seemed startled to see me. Not happy surprised, but genuinely startled, like she wasn't expecting me. She was dressed nicer than usual for a weeknight at home, wearing this blue dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. When I asked about it, she said she'd been thinking about going out to grab dinner since she thought I'd be late, but then decided against it. Made sense, I guess. We ordered pizza instead and watched some Netflix show she'd picked out. That weekend, Greg helped us install a new ceiling fan in Tommy's room. The whole time he was up on the ladder, Jessica was down below supposedly steadying it, but I caught them making eye contact more than seemed necessary for ceiling fan installation. When I mentioned it later, Jessica laughed it off and said I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. The accounting profession makes you suspicious of everything, looking for discrepancies that might not even exist. But the discrepancies kept adding up. Jessica started going grocery shopping more often, sometimes twice a week, when once had always been enough. She joined a yoga class that met on Tuesday evenings, which was great in theory, except when I drove by the yoga studio one Tuesday night on my way home from a client dinner. The parking lot was empty and the lights were off. When I asked her about it, she said the class had been canceled, but she'd gone for a walk instead to clear her head. The phone calls started around the same time. Jessica had always been social, talking to her sister or her college friends, but these calls were different. She'd take them in the other room, speaking in lower voices. When I'd walk in, she'd wrap up quickly, saying it was just work stuff or her mom calling about something boring. But Jessica worked part-time at a dental office, and her mom lived in Florida and usually called on Sunday mornings. By April, I was keeping mental notes like I was building a case file. Jessica had started working out more, which she said was because she wanted to get back in shape after having Tommy. She bought new clothes, got her hair done more frequently, and seemed to have this glow about her that I hadn't seen since we were dating. Part of me wanted to believe it was just her taking better care of herself, but another part of me, the part that spent 40 hours a week looking for financial irregularities, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday night in late April. I'd been working on a particularly complex audit that was driving me crazy, so I decided to leave the office early and surprise Jessica with takeout from her favorite Thai place. As I turned onto our street, I saw Greg's truck pulling out of our driveway. Both vehicles stopped for a moment at the end of our street, and I could see Jessica in the passenger seat of his truck. I sat there in my car, takeout getting cold in the passenger seat, watching my wife drive away with our neighbor. They weren't heading toward the grocery store or anywhere else that would make sense for a neighborly favor. They were heading toward the highway, toward the part of town where the motels were. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I did what any forensic accountant would do when faced with suspicious activity. I started gathering evidence. I went home, put the Thai food in the refrigerator, and waited. Jessica came back around 10:30, her purse slung over her shoulder, keys jingling as she walked through the front door like nothing had happened. She found me sitting at the kitchen table with a beer, going through some work files. Her hair looked different, a little messed up despite the fact that it hadn't been windy. Her lipstick was gone, though I remembered her wearing it that morning. When I asked how her evening was, she said she'd been at her sister's place helping her organize some old photo albums. Her sister lived 20 minutes in the opposite direction from where I'd seen them driving. The next morning, I started what I privately called Operation Helpful Neighbor. I began paying attention to patterns, documenting times and dates, cross-referencing Jessica's stories with observable facts. It sounds clinical when I put it like that, but when your world might be falling apart, you cling to what you know how to do. I learned that Greg's truck disappeared from his driveway every Tuesday and Thursday around 7 p.m., the same times Jessica claimed to be at yoga or running errands. I started leaving work early on random days, driving by our house to see what was happening. More often than not, Greg's truck would be gone, and so would Jessica's car. The grocery store receipts became my smoking gun. Jessica had always been the one to handle grocery shopping, and she'd always been responsible about keeping receipts for our budget. But when I started actually looking at them, the dates and times didn't add up with her stories. She'd tell me she'd been grocery shopping on Tuesday evening, but the receipt would be time-stamped for Wednesday morning. Small discrepancies, but enough to paint a picture of someone covering their tracks. I hired a private investigator in May. His name was Frank, a former cop who specialized in matrimonial cases. I felt like a cliché, sitting in his office explaining my suspicions to a guy who'd probably heard the same story 1,000 times before. Frank was professional about it, no judgment, just business. He quoted me a daily rate and said he'd need about a week to get a clear picture of what was happening. The photos Frank brought me were worse than I'd imagined. Jessica and Greg at a motel about 30 minutes from our house. Jessica and Greg having dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of in the next town over. Jessica and Greg walking hand in hand through a park where she'd never expressed any interest in going. The timestamp showed this had been going on for at least 3 months, probably longer. But the photo that hit me hardest was one of them at what looked like a doctor's office. Jessica was coming out of a building I didn't recognize, and Greg was waiting for her in his truck. The sign on the building said, Women's Health Associates. Frank had included a note explaining that he'd followed up and confirmed it was an OB/GYN office. That night, I confronted Jessica. Not about the affair, not yet, but about the doctor's appointment. I asked her directly if she'd been to see a doctor recently, if there was anything she needed to tell me about her health. She looked genuinely confused and said no, she hadn't been to any doctor. She asked why I was asking, and I said I'd just been worried about her lately, that she seemed different. The lie came so easily to her that it scared me. Either she was a much better liar than I'd ever realized, or something bigger was happening here than just an affair. I called Frank the next morning and told him to dig deeper. I wanted to know everything about Greg. Background check, employment history, medical records if he could get them, financial information, the works. I also asked him to find out more about that doctor's office visit. What Frank found changed everything. Greg wasn't just some divorced handyman living next door. His real name was Gregory Hoffman, and he had a criminal record. Nothing violent, but a pattern of fraud and identity theft going back 15 years. He'd been arrested twice for insurance fraud, once for credit card scams, and had served 18 months in county jail about 5 years ago. More disturbing was his employment history. Greg claimed to work construction, but Frank couldn't find any record of steady employment. Instead, there were bank records showing regular deposits from various sources, including what appeared to be several ongoing insurance claims and a monthly payment from a settlement that Frank couldn't fully trace. But the most shocking discovery was about the doctor's office. Frank had managed to get in touch with someone who worked there, and while they couldn't share specific medical information, they confirmed that Jessica had been a patient there. Not for a routine checkup, but for prenatal care. Jessica was pregnant, and she was far enough along that she'd been going to regular appointments for at least 2 months, which meant she'd been hiding this from me while carrying on with Greg. I spent that entire weekend trying to process what I'd learned. My wife was having an affair with a career criminal, she was pregnant and hiding it from me, and I had no idea how long any of this had been going on. Everything I'd thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my family, was built on lies. But there was one more piece of the puzzle I hadn't considered yet. One more question that would turn out to be the most important of all. The pregnancy revelation sent my mind racing in directions I didn't want it to go. If Jessica was hiding a current pregnancy, What else might she have hidden? I found myself staring at Tommy differently, looking for features that might not be mine, mannerisms that might belong to someone else. Tommy had my dark hair and Jessica's green eyes, but beyond that, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. His nose was different from both of ours. His hands were longer and more slender than mine had been at his age. When he smiled, there was something about the shape of his mouth that reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place who. I started doing internet searches about paternity tests, reading about how common paternal discrepancy actually was. The statistics were more disturbing than I'd expected. Depending on the study, anywhere from 2 to 10% of children weren't biologically related to the man they called father. In most cases, the fathers never found out. Frank had finished his background investigation on Greg, and when we met at a coffee shop to go over the results, he dropped another bombshell. Greg had been living in our neighborhood for almost 4 years, not the 2 years since his divorce like Jessica and I had assumed. The divorce story was true, but he'd moved next door to us when Tommy was barely 6 months old. The timeline was starting to make terrible sense. Jessica and I had gone through a rough patch when Tommy was born. I'd been working longer hours trying to establish myself at the firm. Jessica had been dealing with postpartum depression, and we'd barely been speaking to each other for months. I'd assumed that phase of our marriage was behind us, but maybe it had just gone underground. Frank also discovered that Greg had been paying for Jessica's phone plan for the past year. She had a second phone, one I'd never seen, registered under his account. When Frank showed me the phone records, the frequency of calls and texts between them was staggering. Sometimes they were communicating dozens of times per day, even when they were supposedly just neighbors who occasionally helped each other out. But the detail that made my blood run cold was in Greg's financial records. 18 months ago, he'd made a large deposit to his savings account, about $20,000. The deposit memo said insurance settlement, but Frank couldn't find any record of an accident or claim that would justify that amount. However, the timing coincided exactly with when Jessica and I had taken out an increased life insurance policy on me. I confronted Jessica that night, but not about the affair or the pregnancy or even the secret phone. Instead, I asked her about the life insurance policy, whether she remembered why we'd increased the coverage. She said it had been Greg's suggestion, that he'd mentioned how important it was for young families to have adequate coverage in case something happened to the primary breadwinner. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made me realize she probably didn't even understand what she'd just admitted. Greg hadn't just been sleeping with my wife. He'd been positioning himself to profit from my death. I called Frank immediately and told him I wanted 24-hour surveillance on both Jessica and Greg. I also asked him to look into any connections Greg might have to people who could arrange accidents. Frank was quiet for a long moment before he said he'd worked cases like this before, and they rarely ended well for anyone involved. The surveillance photos from the next week showed Jessica and Greg meeting with a third person I didn't recognize. A man in his 50s with a criminal background that included assault and weapons charges. Frank identified him as someone Greg had served time with, someone who now worked as what the police called a problem solver for people who needed problems solved permanently. That's when I knew I had to get out of the house, but I also knew I couldn't just disappear without Tommy. If he was my son, I couldn't leave him with people who were planning to kill me. If he wasn't my son, he was still a 3-year-old boy who didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever Jessica and Greg had planned. I scheduled the DNA test for the following Tuesday, telling Jessica I was taking Tommy for a routine checkup with a new pediatrician. The testing facility was in the next county over, far enough away that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Tommy was confused about why we needed to swab his mouth, but he cooperated when I told him it was to make sure he was healthy. The lab technician, a woman in her 40s named Karen, seemed professional and efficient. She took the samples, explained the process, and said results would be available in 3 to 5 business days. Everything seemed routine until she looked at Tommy more closely while she was labeling the samples. She asked me to step into her office while Tommy played with some toys in the waiting area. Karen sat me down and pulled out a file folder that seemed unusually thick for a simple paternity test. She told me that Tommy's DNA had triggered an automatic flag in their system, not for paternity, but for something else entirely. Tommy's genetic profile matched evidence from an unsolved criminal case from 4 years ago, a case involving a sexual assault that had resulted in pregnancy. The victim had been a woman named Amanda Chun, who had been attacked in her apartment during a home invasion. She'd been 3 months pregnant at the time of the attack, and the trauma had caused her to lose the baby. But the DNA evidence collected from the scene had been preserved, and Tommy's sample was showing markers that suggested a familial relationship to the perpetrator. Karen explained that they were legally obligated to report this to the police, but she wanted to give me a chance to understand what this might mean before they made the call. She asked me if I knew anything about Tommy's biological origins, if there was any possibility that he wasn't conceived under normal circumstances. That's when everything clicked into place. Jessica's story about Tommy's conception had never quite added up. She'd claimed she got pregnant during a weekend getaway we'd taken to celebrate our anniversary, but when I looked back at the dates, the timing was off by several weeks. She'd also been unusually secretive during her pregnancy, insisting on going to all her doctor's appointments alone and never wanting to discuss the details. What if Tommy wasn't the result of an affair? What if he was the result of something much worse? The police arrived at the lab within 30 minutes of Karen's call. Detective Rodriguez, a woman who looked like she'd seen every terrible thing humans could do to each other, interviewed me while a female officer kept Tommy occupied with coloring books and juice boxes. I told her everything I knew about Jessica, Greg, and the timeline of Tommy's birth. When I mentioned Greg's real name and criminal background, Detective Rodriguez's expression changed completely. She made several phone calls while I waited, and when she came back, she had that look cops get when a cold case suddenly gets hot. Gregory Hoffman had been a suspect in the Amanda Chen assault, but they'd never had enough evidence to charge him. He'd had an alibi for the night of the attack, provided by a woman who lived with him at the time. The woman's name was Jessica Martinez, but she'd been using her maiden name then because she'd been married to someone else. Jessica had been married before, to a man named Robert Martinez who died in a car accident about 6 months before she met me. The accident had been investigated as suspicious because Robert had recently increased his life insurance policy, but they'd never found evidence of foul play. The primary beneficiary had been Jessica, and the person who'd suggested the insurance increase had been her boyfriend at the time, Gregory Hoffman. Detective Rodriguez explained that they'd been tracking Greg for years, suspecting him of being involved in a series of insurance fraud schemes that involved finding women in vulnerable situations, gaining their trust, and then manipulating them into situations where their husbands would die under circumstances that looked accidental. The pattern was always the same. Greg would identify a woman going through a difficult time in her marriage, usually someone with young children and financial pressures. He'd present himself as helpful and understanding, slowly building a relationship while gathering information about the family's financial situation. He'd suggest increasing life insurance coverage for the children's sake, and then arrange for accidents to happen. Robert Martinez had died when his car went off a mountain road during what was supposed to be a weekend fishing trip. The trip had been Greg's idea, and Greg had been the last person to see Robert alive. But Greg had an alibi for the time of the accident. He'd been with Jessica, comforting her about her troubled marriage. Amanda Chen had been Robert's ex-girlfriend, someone who'd started asking questions about his death and threatening to go to the police. The assault on Amanda had been meant to silence her, but when she survived and got pregnant from the attack, Greg had convinced Jessica that they needed to take the baby and raise it as their own, as a way to give meaning to the tragedy. The DNA test hadn't just revealed that Tommy wasn't my biological son. It had revealed that Tommy was the product of a violent crime, and that the woman I'd been married to for 8 years had been complicit in covering it up. But there was more. Detective Rodriguez had been in contact with police in 3 other states where similar patterns had emerged. Women whose husbands had died in suspicious accidents, all after increasing their life insurance policies on the advice of a helpful friend named Greg. In each case, Greg had disappeared shortly after the payouts, and the women had eventually remarried and moved away. Jessica wasn't just Greg's accomplice. She was his pattern. He'd been using her to get close to men, to learn their routines and vulnerabilities, and then to collect insurance money when they died. I was supposed to be victim number 4. The surveillance Frank had arranged probably saved my life. Detective Rodriguez showed me photos from that morning, taken just hours before the DNA test. Greg and his associate had been watching our house, and they'd followed me to the lab. They'd been waiting in the parking lot when the police arrived, probably planning to make their move when Tommy and I came back outside. The police arrived at the lab within 30 minutes of Karen's call. Detective Rodriguez, a woman who looked like she'd seen every terrible thing humans could do to each other, interviewed me while a female officer kept Tommy occupied with coloring books and juice boxes. I told her everything I knew about Jessica, Greg, and the timeline of Tommy's birth. When I mentioned Greg's real name and criminal background, Detective Rodriguez's expression changed completely. She made several phone calls while I waited, and when she came back, she had that look cops get when a cold case suddenly gets hot. Gregory Hoffman had been a suspect in the Amanda Chen assault, but they'd never had enough evidence to charge him. He'd had an alibi for the night of the attack, provided by a woman who lived with him at the time. The woman's name was Jessica Martinez, but she'd been using her maiden name then because she'd been married to someone else. Jessica had been married before to a man named Robert Martinez who died in a car accident about 6 months before she met me. The accident had been investigated as suspicious because Robert had recently increased his life insurance policy, but they'd never found evidence of foul play. The primary beneficiary had been Jessica, and the person who'd suggested the insurance increase had been her boyfriend at the time, Gregory Hoffman. Detective Rodriguez explained that they'd been tracking Greg for years, suspecting him of being involved in a series of insurance fraud schemes that involved finding women in vulnerable situations, gaining their trust, and then manipulating them into situations where their husbands would die under circumstances that looked accidental. The pattern was always the same. Greg would identify a woman going through a difficult time in her marriage, usually someone with young children and financial pressures. He'd present himself as helpful and understanding, slowly building a relationship while gathering information about the family's financial situation. He'd suggest increasing life insurance coverage for the children's sake, and then arrange for accidents to happen. Robert Martinez had died when his car went off a mountain road during what was supposed to be a weekend fishing trip. The trip had been Greg's idea, and Greg had been the last person to see Robert alive. But Greg had an alibi for the time of the accident. He'd been with Jessica, comforting her about her troubled marriage. Amanda Chun had been Robert's ex-girlfriend, someone who'd started asking questions about his death and threatening to go to the police. The assault on Amanda had been meant to silence her, but when she survived and got pregnant from the attack, Greg had convinced Jessica that they needed to take the baby and raise it as their own, as a way to give meaning to the tragedy. The DNA test hadn't just revealed that Tommy wasn't my biological son. It had revealed that Tommy was the product of a violent crime, and that the woman I'd been married to for 8 years had been complicit in covering it up. But there was more. Detective Rodriguez had been in contact with police in 3 other states where similar patterns had emerged. Women whose husbands had died in suspicious accidents, all after increasing their life insurance policies on the advice of a helpful friend named Greg. In each case, Greg had disappeared shortly after the payouts, and the women had eventually remarried and moved away. Jessica wasn't just Greg's accomplice. She was his pattern. He'd been using her to get close to men, to learn their routines and vulnerabilities, and then to collect insurance money when they died. I was supposed to be victim number 4. The surveillance Frank had arranged probably saved my life. Detective Rodriguez showed me photos from that morning, taken just hours before the DNA test. Greg and his associate had been watching our house, and they'd followed me to the lab. They'd been waiting in the parking lot when the police arrived, probably planning to make their move when Tommy and I came back outside. Both men were arrested that afternoon. Jessica was picked up at our house, where she was found packing suitcases and preparing to leave. In her purse, police found a second phone with text messages detailing plans for my accident, which was supposed to happen during a hiking trip Greg had been trying to convince me to take the following weekend. The trial took 8 months. Jessica pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges in exchange for testifying against Greg. She admitted to her role in Robert Martinez's death and confirmed that Tommy had been taken from Amanda Chun after the assault. She also revealed that there had been 2 other men before Robert, both of whom had died under suspicious circumstances after meeting Greg through her. Greg was sentenced to life in prison without parole for multiple counts of murder, assault, fraud, and kidnapping. Jessica got 25 years with the possibility of parole after 15. The judge called it one of the most calculating and cold-blooded schemes he'd ever encountered. Amanda Chun, Tommy's biological mother, had been living in Seattle, working as a nurse and trying to rebuild her life after the assault. When the police contacted her about Tommy, she broke down crying. She'd never stopped hoping that someday she'd find her son. The custody situation was complicated. Legally, Amanda was Tommy's mother, but he'd been living with me as his father for 3 years. Child services, the lawyers, and the psychologists all agreed that the transition needed to be handled carefully. Tommy was too young to understand the full situation, but he knew that Mommy had gone away and that there were a lot of new people asking him questions. Amanda and I met several times with a family counselor to figure out how to handle the situation. She was an incredible woman, someone who'd survived something horrible and rebuilt her life with a strength I couldn't imagine. She didn't want to traumatize Tommy any further, but she also deserved to know her son. We worked out an arrangement where Tommy would stay with me during the transition period, but Amanda would be involved in his life as much as possible. She moved back to our area and found a job at the local hospital. Tommy was confused at first about why he suddenly had 2 families, but kids are resilient in ways adults aren't. 6 months after the trial ended, Amanda and I got married. Not because we fell in love, though that came later, but because we both loved Tommy and wanted to give him the most stable family situation possible. It sounds crazy when I explain it like that, but after everything we'd all been through, conventional romance seemed less important than building something real and honest. The house next door, Greg's house, sat empty for almost a year before new neighbors moved in. Every time I looked at it, I thought about how close I'd come to not being here to see Tommy grow up, how easily everything could have gone differently if I hadn't noticed Jessica's purse missing that night or if I hadn't decided to get the DNA test. Tommy is 7 now, and he knows the truth about where he came from, explained in age-appropriate ways that he can understand. He knows Amanda is his birth mother and that Jessica made some very bad choices. He still asks about Jessica sometimes, wondering when she's coming home, and those conversations break my heart every time. Amanda and I had a daughter 2 years ago, Sophie, and watching Tommy be a big brother has been one of the few purely good things to come out of all of this. He's protective of her in a way that makes me think he understands, on some level, how precious family really is. The insurance money from Robert Martinez's death was seized by the court and used to pay restitution to the other victims' families. Jessica's share of our house was sold to pay for Tommy's therapy and legal expenses. Greg's house was eventually bought by a young couple with twins who have no idea what happened next door. I still work as a forensic accountant, but now I specialize in insurance fraud cases. Detective Rodriguez and I have worked together on several cases where the patterns remind us of Greg's methods. There are more people like him out there, and more people like Jessica, and more victims who never get the chance to figure out what's happening before it's too late. The thing that still keeps me awake sometimes is thinking about how normal it all seemed while it was happening. Jessica's jokes about the helpful neighbor, Greg's willingness to fix things around the house, the gradual changes in our routine that seemed innocent at first. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic music and obvious villains. Sometimes it just looks like a neighbor with a toolbox and a friendly smile. But mostly, I sleep well now. Tommy is safe, Amanda is safe, Sophie is safe, and Greg is in a cage where he can't hurt anyone else. Jessica will probably get out of prison someday, but by then Tommy will be old enough to make his own decisions about whether he wants her in his life. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's just about making sure the people you love get to wake up tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and all the tomorrows they deserve to have. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.